Well, good morning again, everyone. I'm excited to share this story with you today, this sermon, which tells a story that's probably, part of it tells a story that's maybe familiar to many of you, but there's another part that involves us, Unitarian Universalism, that many of you today are not as familiar with. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. It's hard to believe that the March on Washington was 60 years ago. The anniversary is actually tomorrow. I was not alive quite yet, so I can't say I remember it, but I've certainly read a great deal about it, and of course have watched and listened to Dr. King's speech many times. What was so, from all that I know, what was so memorable about the march was that it brought so many people from so many different communities, so many different walks of life that, 250,000 people just put aside what they were doing and what was going on in their life to be there in that powerful, transformational moment. Some were leaving incredibly difficult circumstances. I think as Dr. King said in the I Have a Dream speech, some have left, narrow jail cells to be here with us today. And it's just quite an incredible moment in our nation's history. What I want to talk about today is, as Tori's reading alluded to, was a decision that the Unitarian Universalist Association and Beacon Press made at that time, or 10 years later in 1973, to publish the first complete edition of what we now today call the Pentagon Papers. This was a decision that put Beacon Press and the UUA at considerable risk and opened both up to investigation and intimidation from the Nixon administration, including a threatening phone call from the president himself to the director of tiny little Beacon Press. Doesn't the president have more important things to do with their time? So I want to tell you that story because I think that decision offers important lessons about the role and responsibility of organized religion to resist a status quo that is both unethical and unjust. Should denominations and faith communities like this one oppose laws and policies that, in Dr. King's powerful words, degrade human personality? And perhaps more challengingly, should we be willing to break the law in order to, again, as Dr. King said, arouse the conscience of the community? Very important questions, especially in the world we find ourselves in today. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the story of the Pentagon Papers and their publication in excerpt form, first by the New York Times and then the Washington Post. I don't know if any of you saw that movie, The Post, starring Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks, which tells the story of the Washington Post decision to publish excerpts from the Pentagon Papers after an injunction and court order stopped their initial publication by the New York Times. The Post and the Times appealed that injunction all the way to the US Supreme Court, which ruled that the effort to suppress publication of the papers violated the First Amendment protection of freedom of the press. Now, the Pentagon Papers were a voluminous, like thousands of pages, study of US involvement in the Vietnam War, commissioned by the Defense Department in the late 1960s. The report did run into thousands of pages which the government did not want to get out because those pages very clearly revealed that the United States had been, and the US government in particular, administration after administration, had been lying to the American people for years about both the goals of the war in Vietnam and the tactics used in fighting it. Now, believing that the American people had a right to know about this governmental deceit, a former Defense Department analyst who played a role in the drafting of the Pentagon Papers themselves, Daniel Ellsberg, copied the report in its entirety and leaked portions of it to the Times and the Washington Post. Now, when Ellsberg first leaked the Pentagon Papers, he hoped that they would someday be published in their entirety, meaning in book form. Now, publishing the papers would undoubtedly be legal dynamite for any publisher, so Ellsberg and a few others sought out a sympathetic member of Congress to read the papers into the congressional record. In this way, it was pretty ingenious. In this way, Ellsberg hoped that congressional immunity would cover a publisher that published words from the congressional record, so that therefore an unabridged copy of the papers could be made available. Now, before I continue on with the story of Beacon Press and the UUA, let me say a word about Daniel Ellsberg. Some of you may have read or heard that he just recently passed away at the age of 92. Here's a couple of images. There's Ellsberg more around the time of the Pentagon Papers, and that's him more recently. Now, Daniel Ellsberg faced stiff criminal prosecution for leaking top secret documents and could have spent years in prison. But as his case went to trial, this is not going to sound that surprising, gross, and I mean gross misconduct in the way the government handled his case, the government meaning the Nixon administration. Because of that, the judge dismissed all charges against Ellsberg, and he spent the rest of his very long life as a wonderful peace activist and writer. Well, I think it's fair to say that many today see the leaking of the Pentagon Papers as courageous and even admirable. Even to this day, there are those who think Daniel Ellsberg was a traitor who undermined national security. And in case you think those voices are only on the extreme, believe it or not, I think just 2 years ago, the New York Times itself published a piece condemning Ellsberg's actions as undermining democracy. I guess things have changed a little bit from the days when the Times worked with Ellsberg in publishing the papers. Now, as I reflect on Daniel Ellsberg's actions and those of our own denomination that I'll tell you about in a minute, I have to say that I see his decision to leak the papers as both courageous and as justified. And the reason I do so is precisely for the reasons that Dr. King articulated. Yes, Daniel Ellsberg broke the law, but when the legal system itself is used to cover up lies and to hide the truth about a war that was taking thousands of lives, truth-telling and the need to stop war, in my view, easily meet Dr. King's criteria for breaking an unjust law to arouse the conscience of a nation. That is precisely what Daniel Ellsberg did, and I, for one, will always see his actions as being heroic. And I also see the actions of the Unitarian Universalist Association and of Beacon Press as being equally worthy of praise and admiration. Now, for those of you who don't know who or what Beacon Press is, today, and it always has been, a Boston-based publisher that was, for much of its existence, part of the Unitarian and owned by, if you will, the Unitarian Universalist Association. Although it's a completely independent entity today, Beacon's offices, at least the last time I was there, are still located at the headquarters of the UUA in Boston, and there's still a very close relationship between the two. Now, because publishers, as I said before, might not be provided with that same freedom of the press protection that the Supreme Court gave to the New York Times and the Washington Post, Ellsberg and others came up with this strategy of having the papers read into the congressional record. Again, and he hoped that this idea of congressional immunity would make it safe for a publisher to publish the papers. And it's this point that an anti-war senator from Alaska named Mike Gravel enters the story. Gravel was an outspoken critic of the Vietnam War, and he just happened to also be a Unitarian Universalist. After receiving a complete copy of the papers from go-between between him and Ellsberg, Gravel used his chairmanship of an obscure Senate subcommittee, I think on something like building and grounds or something, to read all 5,000 pages into the congressional record. So this is why if you get invited to a building or grounds meeting, you really ought to show up. You never know what might take place, you know? Now from there, Gravel sought out a publisher to turn the papers into a book. Many dozens and dozens of larger publishing houses and academic presses like Harvard Press and so on declined. They just didn't feel it was safe to go there. So Senator Gravel turned to Beacon Press. And I'm so proud to say that without hesitation, the leadership of Beacon Press and the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association at the time, Bob West, decided, from what I've read, without a lot of hesitation, to publish what came to be known as the Senator Gravel edition of the Pentagon Papers. 4 hardback volumes. Now, I don't know if we can fully appreciate what a gutsy and courageous decision it was to publish the papers. Beacon Press is small, and at the time they didn't have the money needed to publish such a lengthy book. And the Unitarian Universalist Association was, how should I say this, kind of a mess at the time, certainly financially. Bob West was doing everything he could to clean that mess up, and there was just a lot going on, and the denomination at one point was on the verge of bankruptcy. Think about how easy it would have been. I probably would have said this. Wow, that sounds like a really important thing to do, but man, I'm sorry, it's just really bad timing. We just can't do it. But that's not what Bob West or Beacon's director, a gentleman named Gobin Stair, he's the one that received that phone call, decided to do. And as President Bob West said so simply but eloquently, we believe that by publishing the Pentagon Papers, we will help prevent our nation from becoming involved in another war like this one. But the UUA and Beacon Press had another problem, the almost immediate campaign of intimidation from the Nixon administration. I already mentioned that phone call from the President of the United States to Gobin Stair, who was told in that call, by the way, that the government wasn't just investigating Beacon or the denomination, they were investigating him personally. I'm sorry, can I say something very unministerial about President Nixon? What a jerk. I mean, there was also, by the way, visits to UUA headquarters from 2 Department of Defense officials. There was a grand jury indictment and an investigation of the denomination's bank records. But in spite of that pressure, the UUA and Beacon Press just published. They followed through on their decision, and they fought back in the courts. I'd also add that they received overwhelming support from Unitarian Universalists across the country, and that endorsement you heard earlier from the General Assembly was just one of many examples of Unitarian Universalists rallying around their leadership. You might also be interested to know that Ellsberg and Gravel's strategy of reading the papers into the congressional record actually didn't work. Another appeal went to the Supreme Court, and this time the Supreme Court ruled against Beacon and the UUA this time, because they said congressional immunity doesn't cover a religious denomination or a publisher. So that wasn't good. But I guess you could say, thankfully, the administration didn't follow up on prosecuting the denomination or Beacon because the FBI and others got kind of absorbed with this little thing called Watergate. So the matter was basically dropped. So what do we make of what has to be, I think, one of the most courageous moments in the history of Unitarian Universalism? Were Beacon Press and the UUA right to take such a risk? While they had the support of most UUs, that support, as nothing in Unitarian Universalism, was not 100% unanimous. Some criticized the denomination for being too political. Others thought maybe we were joining Daniel Ellsberg in committing treason for publishing government secrets and undermining the war effort. Now, admittedly, those voices were in the minority, and today we look back on this moment as a high point in our history. And the reason I think we are so proud of the UUA and of Beacon Press again connects back to Dr. King's words in the letter from Birmingham jail. As we see and experience every day, there are so many unjust laws, so many inhumane policies, so many falsehoods that are harming and, yes, brutalizing human beings. As a religious tradition that affirms the dignity and worth of all people and the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, how could we sit back and not take a stand against a war built on lies and deceit? How can we or any faith community sit back today and do nothing in the face of so much suffering, manipulation, and inhumanity? As Dr. King asks so powerfully in another part of the letter, and this question, I think, haunts me over and over again ever since I became a minister. His question is this: will the contemporary church be a strong ally for justice, or will it remain silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows? I think that's the most important question that's ever been asked of religious communities, most important one I've ever read. And let me just say that as Unitarian Universalists committed to social justice, there's no more important question for our congregation or any congregation to answer. Too often, faith communities profess wonderful values, but when the rubber hits the road and showing up for justice and peace means taking risks, too often organized religion takes the easy way out and remains safe and asleep behind those stained glass windows. But for one shining moment in the early 1970s, Unitarian Universalism most assuredly rose to Dr. King's challenge. We didn't hide behind those stained glass windows or decide taking action was simply too risky or too controversial. And you know what? We responded with rapidity and with speed. We didn't use the excuse of policies or procedures like Robert's Rules of Order to go slow or do nothing. Instead, we acted boldly and swiftly because Unitarian Universalist principles and values were at stake. People were dying. Democracy was being undermined, and truth was being sacrificed on the altar of power and violence. I hope Unitarian Universalism and the UU Congregation of Charlottesville will always act when justice, when truth, and when peace demand it. That's who we are. That is what we do. And that is how this faith requires us to live. Amen, and may it be so.